The United States would continue to intervene in Latin American affairs for several different reasons. From a logistical standpoint, it is exceptionally difficult to bring naval ships from one side of the United States to the other side. So, if you have naval ships in Virginia and they needed to be redeployed to California, there's two different ways that you could possibly do that. I guess you could load them up on massive trains or trucks and maybe try and drive them across 3,000 miles. That's exceptionally difficult and probably impossible. Or you could go around Virginia all the way down the Caribbean, all the way down the tip of South America, and all the way back up to, California. That is incredibly tedious, and that's roughly about 12,000 miles along the trip. Well, you might notice that right about here, this is where you have the Atlantic Ocean by way of the Caribbean Sea, with a narrow isthmus right there in Panama that connects to the vast Pacific Ocean. So you could potentially take ships from Virginia through this isthmus, if you could cut a path, and basically more than twice remove the amount of territory or sea that you would need to deploy United States ships, commercial or otherwise. So it was deemed in this area, preferably first Nicaragua, the modern country thereof. However, things were unstable there. And even though it was flat in Nicaragua, it would be longer. Whereas over here in Panama, the narrow isthmus in modern day Panama, which used to actually be a part of Colombia at the time, a French engineering company actually started digging what would be the precursor to a large canal. When negotiations broke down between the French company and the Colombian government, the United States intervened and said, "Hey, Colombia, we'll pay you this much and continue to pay rent for this much if you let us build it and have authority." And the Colombian Senate basically said, "No, thank you." And that's ridiculous. We demand, if anything like that's going to happen, we're going to demand way more than that. So there had been talks of this area being different. Here's Colombia right here, and this little stretch right there, that isthmus, that peninsula right here, if you will, just that extends north like a panhandle. That's Panama. There were revolutionaries in Panama who wanted to break from the Colombian government. So the United States, recognizing that Colombia was going to put up a massive roadblock, we supported a revolutionary movement to basically help Panama claim its independence from Colombia. So the United States sent several naval warships along with a regiment of United States troops and put them on the Panamanian beachhead. And as the Panamanians declared themselves independent and declared a revolt, Colombian military authorities saw that the United States was already there and basically said, "Okay, no, you can have them." So Panama basically won its independence. And that paved the way for the United States to negotiate with the brand new Panamanian government to basically honor the same terms as what they had with the Colombian government, to build the canal. So, over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, the United States would build the canal, and to this day, the canal stands. The canal is used on a daily basis, and the United States had full autonomy over the Panama Canal until 1999. You see, in the late 70s, we had an American president who basically signed it away. But that's for a future chapter. Okay. Otherwise, though, now, beginning in 1914, American vessels, whether military or commercial, could now go from a narrow passage from the Atlantic via the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean. You have now opened up half of the entire world, and you've done it in half the amount of time. That is awesome. Okay? So, That also goes along with the United States wielding a big stick in the region because we're exerting our influence with Latin American countries and saying, hey, help us. We're helping you. And in doing so, it also adds to the idea that the United States is going to wield its influence elsewhere in the Caribbean or in Latin America. And in Nicaragua, for example, in order to advance some of America's economic policy in Latin America, the United States wanted to invest in emerging markets, like Nicaragua, for example. Some people call this a dollar diplomacy. Some undeveloped markets, you're now going to be investing in them. They're emerging. The cheap dollar diplomacy was kind of a knock so as to perhaps throw shade, if you will. But American bankers would become involved and invested in Nicaragua, and despite a revolt against some American businessmen, eventually that would be squelched, thus giving way to the larger dollar diplomacy theory. Okay? Elsewhere in the Caribbean, the United States would intervene in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti to wield its influence throughout the Caribbean. We would solidify the United States Virgin Islands as well. But to the United States' immediate south, Mexico, we fought a war against Mexico to basically claim what is present day the United States Southwest back in the 1840s. Mexico, over the course of the next several decades, would be ruled by Porfirio Diaz. And the ruling class in Mexico would be known as the Porfiriato. You would have a ruling class of wealthy Mexicans and then everybody else. Okay? So it would become difficult for Mexicans to really ascend. And Porfirio Diaz, being essentially a dictator of Mexico for the better part of 30 some odd years, a lot of things became rooted. One of the things that Porfirio Diaz was really known for was his invitations to American businessmen to invest in Mexico. Over the course of El Porfiriato, American businessmen invested very heavily and controlled a large part of the Mexican economy. Eventually, revolutionary ideology against the establishment of the Porfiriato would lead to his ouster. And with that, there would be a very heavy resentment of Americans in Mexico. So you would have a number of Mexicans, one in particular, Francisco Madero, who overthrew Porfirio Diaz, and he promised democratic reform in Mexico to make things more equal, but he also seemed somewhat hostile to Americans. And that seemed fine, but we quietly encouraged another revolutionary named Victoriano Huerta to basically oust Madero. Huerta wanted control. So you have the Madero regime under a little bit of a vigilant attack from the Huerta revolutionary faction. And things came to blows when folks in the new government eventually overtook Madero, and his new government had Madero executed. Woodrow Wilson, United States president, basically said, hey, we supported your regime, but not your government of butchers. Huh. So the United States wouldn't recognize Huerta, but then you had Huerta's regime toppled by Victoriano Carranza. You see a pattern here? Ouster, execution. Ouster, execution. Ouster, execution. You see Mexico embrace the world of turmoil. Okay? Modern day Mexico to this day is very heavily conflicted. I grew up 7 miles from the Mexican border down in South Texas. Mexico was just a few miles from me. My dad worked at the Progreso Port of Entry, and he also worked at Reynosa as well. And my family's from there, down in South Texas, but I also have a Mexican lineage myself. My mother's parents, my grandparents, were born in Jalisco. And it was shortly after this era in Mexican history that both of their families would eventually immigrate to the United States. And for my grandfather in particular, his family, he included, worked in the railroad industry, as did many Mexicans. So that is my personal connection to Mexico. I'm Mexican American. I grew up 7 miles from Mexico. I'm very proud of that. I love the country that is Mexico. I think it's a very beautiful country. Man, there's a lot of turmoil. The border towns near where I grew up are rampant with drug cartel violence, seizure for control, and interactions with one another that are often extremely violent and bloody. And then, of course, you throw in Mexican federal troops in the mix as well, trying to control things, and some of the things are getting out of hand. You even have a faction of former Mexican troops that had been once trained by United States Navy SEALs and Special Operations Forces. You have paramilitary groups that are now basically running cartels. It's a mess. It really is, and a lot of bloodshed, and a lot of people have died because of it. The turmoil and violence that has been seen, especially in northern Mexico, is nothing new in Mexican history. It stems from before the Mexican Revolution, but it was during this era, the era starting with the ouster of Porfirio Diaz, leading way to Madero, to Huerta, to Carranza, and the struggle for power and the power vacuum that got sucked out of the Mexican society once Porfirio Diaz was ousted. You have a number of people vying for power, and the only way to oust them would be to physically and violently overtake them and kill them. That seems to be a societal issue for Mexico and Mexicans themselves. Okay? It's a very brutal display. In the United States, at this point in time, we recognized, oh boy, there's a lot of stuff going on in Mexico. We need to intervene. One, because you have a lot of American investments there in Mexico, people who are hostile to some of it, by the way. And then also, some of that might actually spill over into the United States. You see, there was one revolutionary named Pancho Villa who at one time had sided with Venustiano Carranza to help gain power and expand the Mexican Revolution to help equalize the country. But when Pancho Villa's faction kind of melted a little bit, the United States cooled on supporting him, and he resented that. And in doing so, Carranza went on a display to actually go into, from the Mexican state of Chihuahua, venture on over into the neighboring town of Columbus, New Mexico, and attack and raid the city. And he killed a number of American citizens in doing so as well. That forced the United States to go into Mexico and chase after not just Pancho Villa, but perhaps Carranza himself. For the better part of 2 years, the United States chased into Mexico. They chased after Pancho Villa and were unsuccessful and eventually pulled their troops out. Okay? But basically, because a band of Mexican bandits had entered into the United States justified sending troops to go after that bandit. That being said, though, the larger conflict in Mexico, the banditry, the lawlessness, the violence, That's nothing new in Mexican history. And unfortunately, that's a part of Mexican history to this day, especially along the border regions in Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Tamaulipas. So, some of those issues have kind of forced their hand. There's been a lack of stability in Mexico that pervades the countryside to this day. And it's affected the United States in our relationship with Mexico as well. Nowadays, you have drug runners and coyotes who are bringing people illegally into the United States. But none of that would exist if there was not a market for that. Drug cartels would be broke if the United States didn't have an insatiable thirst for cocaine or heroin or meth or whichever. Okay? So, in large part, the United States has a lot to do with Mexican violence. Let's be real here. Okay? So, it's not just Mexico. The U.S. plays a part too, or at least American society does. That's something we've got to reach within ourselves. What is the solution to helping restore Mexican stability? It's not just them. Okay? So there are some things that we must do as an American society to promote stability in Mexican soil. Otherwise, though, the United States would eventually, after failing to capture Pancho Villa, they would formally recognize the Carranza regime in 1917 because they had bigger issues about to unfold.